Welcome to this third video podcast on the SESaMe Jean Monnet Chair. We have the pleasure today to have Professor Paolo Tomassetti, who is a Marie Curie Fellow in Aix-en-Provence and currently researcher at the University of Milan. Paolo, we will have some questions for you, and we are very keen on hearing your voice, your prominent voice at the moment in the current debate on the intersection between labor law and environmental sustainability. Now, the synergies between the two, so between labor law and the environment, is crucial in your work, has always been crucial in your work. We were now, in the light of the Sustainable Development Goal number 8, we would like to inquire what is your take about the environmental, if any, dimension of labor law. We were not used to this setting, but not only because of SDGs, but because of the current energy crisis, this becomes a very pressing issue. Could you elaborate on this, please?
Sure. Thank you for the interesting question. Well, when I started to look at the intersections between the regulation of work and the regulation of environment as a fictitious commodity, there were no research in place, no studies that have developed the idea of a synergy and a convergence between the regulation of work and environment as fictitious commodities. So at that time, that is, it was 2015, 2016, except for very few contributions, there were no scholarship on this issue. So the idea of a group of scholars was to build a community of researchers to reflect on the intersections and synergies between the two branches of law in a view of promoting a convergence rather than a divergence or a conflict between the regulation of work and the environment. At that time, one of the big efforts that we faced was to conceptualize and rationalize the idea of environmental sustainability within the boundaries of labor law, because the two fields have been compartmentalized for long. And so one of the main problems was to justify environmental protection also within the boundaries of labor law, because, I mean, in the surface, there were very important technological and societal change that would have justified a more integration between the two branches. Let's think, for example, about the impact on technology on the world of work, the deindustrialization, the fact that there is no more limit or physical boundaries to the workplace. So the workplace is much more close to the idea, the very idea of the environment and the, let's say, etymological dimension of the environment, which is everything that environs a given thing, a person, and a worker in a post-industrial society. So we started to reflect on how to make the two disciplines more convergent and reciprocally familiar with each other. And the main goal was to look at traditional labor law goals and see how they could be rethought in the light of environmental sustainability. So if you take, for example, the classical traditional justification of labor laws, our main question was how can we rethink, for example, the idea of redressing inequality of bargaining power in the employment relationship, including also the environmental dimension, on how the goal of redistributing power and resources from capital to labor could be rethought in the light of environmental challenges. So especially my research was originally concerned with finding a way to regulate work in a way that labor law was more attuned to the environmental sustainability goals. And I tried to analyze different aspects, different dimensions of labor law in the light of environmental sustainability. One of these, for example, was working time. Working time reduction, there is empirical evidence, and that's also the importance of looking at interdisciplinarity beyond law. But empirical evidence in sociology or economics say that working time reduction could have a benefit in terms of labor and environmental justice, because it reduces not only the impact of production on the environment on the one hand, but also it reduces the tendency of to consumerism or productivism of workers, which have more free time to dedicate themselves to forms of reproductive work, which is not traditionally included within the boundaries of labor law. So working time was a key dimension. But also if you think about experiences on how the wage structure is articulated, we have in collective bargaining, for example, at the firm level, experiences of wage rises linked to energy efficiency and energy conservation, which in a way are a system that allow to both reach labor and environmental sustainability at once. Of course, there are many contradictions. These kind of institutions, emerging institutions, which are mainly regulated by collective bargaining at the moment, have implications, negative implications, which should be analyzed, and mainly they are still underexplored. But yeah, there was, a trend starting from the industrial relation systems toward the integration of environmental sustainability goals in traditional labor law goals. Another area was, of course, occupational health and safety, that historically have been the domain where the two dimensions mainly overlap. But again, the idea of protecting the workplace environment was construed within the boundaries of labor law with the idea that there were physical boundaries limiting also the obligation of the employers to protect health and safety of workers and to organize the work organization in a way that was environmentally sustainable, but still within the boundaries of the workplace. So how to rethink occupational health and safety in a way to include also environmental sustainability in the policies that are elaborated and are implemented also thanks to the collaboration of workers was a big challenge. And then another branch of labor law that has strong intersection with the protection of the environment, it's all the labor market regulation, all the social security law, which is part of labor law in a broad sense. So all the labor market institutions and regulations that have an incidence on freedom of choice of workers could help in advancing also environmental sustainability, because if we assume that given all the other variables considered as stable, as steady, if a worker would have the option to choose between a polluting job, let's say a brown job or a green job, at the same condition a worker would choose, of course, a green job where he could earn a living on the one hand, but could also contribute to make the economy more sustainable from an environmental perspective. So as long as we have the possibility to increase the freedom of choice of workers also in the labor market, we could also address one of the root causes of unsustainability, which is dependency. Workers' dependency in the labor market parallels with unsustainability of both working conditions on the one hand and environmental conditions on the other side. As long as we consider inequalities and dependency and hierarchies in the labor market as a root causes also of environmental sustainability.
Thanks. You mentioned repeatedly some alternatives, and here we are also interested, or opposite, or a couple of opposites. We are also interested in of course, in one of the basic questions of labor law, how to strike a balance between labor and capital, how to see the contract of employment embedded in capitalistic enterprises. And you often visualize this with the idea of labor employment contracts as an integrated contract in the firm. So could you let us understand what is this conception, where does it come from, and where does it go?
So this idea of the employment contract, as you said, an integration contract or a contract that goes beyond the typical conflict of interest between capital and labor, which is implicit in any employment relationship in a capitalist economy, should be contextualized. I mean, my reference, which is to an article that I wrote in 2018, to that theory was mainly developed in relation to the shared goal of environmental sustainability within a firm. So basically my argument at that time was that there is still a conflict of interest behind the employment relationship, but I think that there are many possibilities or margins of cooperation between capital and labor within a industrial type of work to promote environmental sustainability. And environmental sustainability could be a shared goal of both workers and employers in terms of, for example, energy efficiency and conservation, which also have a reflection on money savings from companies that can be then redistributed. But there are also other segments of the employment relationship where, for example, cooperation is also accepted within traditional labor law articulation. If you take occupational health and safety, for example, we know that it's true that there is still a conflict of interest, but workers have to cooperate in order to implement all the legislation on occupational health and safety. They have to take care of their own safety and those of their fellow colleagues at work. So there is some room for cooperation within a capitalistic firm. And I think that that's the area where labor and environmental sustainability and the contribution of workers towards environmental sustainability could be justified. And this is one aspect, the one that refers to capitalistic kind of employment relationship. I know that the issue is very sensitive. I'm not arguing that there is a shared common goal in general. But when it comes to environmental sustainability, I think that this is an overarching goal that could be better achieved in cooperation between the capital and labor in capitalistic firms. But if you look at non-familiar forms of capitalism or, I don't know, new types of work organization, and think new or old types of work organization like cooperatives or the work in the commons or the dimension of reproductive work, so outside productive work, stricto sensu, you find many rooms for cooperation between the ownership and workers, in the sense that there is an intrinsic coincidence between subject and object of the employment relationship. And it comes with no surprise that is this dimension where you don't have the typical property-based boundaries between capital and labor is the one that literature says is the most type of organization most close to the idea of sustainability. If you take, for example, the theory of the commons as elaborated by a Nobel Prize Elinor Ostrom, she points to institutions for sustainability, the commons, that goes beyond the traditional dichotomy between the public and the private, the state and the market, which these dichotomies are the classical structures, institutional structures of capitalism, but there is a world beyond these structures that lies in between the public and the private, which is the world of collective autonomy, where the communities have a role in managing, for example, urban areas or local common goods, or a number of activities which are not for profit, under which the idea of a conflict of interest behind the employment relationship could be deconstructed, actually. And then there is the gray zone between these two areas, the capitalistic firms and what is beyond capitalism, which is, for example, the new regulation of the solidarity economy that we have in different countries, including in Italy, with foremost legislation also in France and in other European countries. There are initiatives of the ILO on the regulation of the solidarity economy. So again, this is an area, a gray area, where you could also have companies work in a market economy, but not only for profits, but the social function and the social utility of these companies have an intrinsic relationship with social and environmental sustainability. And it is also, I think, within this kind of economic activities that labor and the environment could find room for convergence rather than divergence.
Thanks very much, Paolo, for your intervention so far, and we hope to see you back here very soon.
Sure.
Thank you.
With pleasure. Thanks.